let's go ahead and talk about muscle contraction. And when we're talking about muscle contraction, this is really in the context of ATP, the sodium-potassium pump, and cardiac action potential. This will all make sense when we bring it together, and I know there's a lot of fragmented pieces that you're learning right now, and there will be more in a couple of other videos I'm going to throw your way. But it will all come together and it will make sense on why we need to know this as a paramedic. So let's go ahead and just start. I'll have a video representation of this after I go through my short slideshow here. But the way that our muscles contract is they get a signal from the nervous system. And this picture right here is representing a nerve and where it innervates into a muscle. Okay? So remember, where a nerve terminates and innervates the muscular system is called the neuromuscular junction. So this nerve comes down and releases neurotransmitters, all right? Specifically acetylcholine. You don't need to know that now. We'll deal with that in a later lecture. That neurotransmitter attaches to a receptor site and tells that muscle what it wants it to do. Now, remember, muscles have the ability to do one thing, really, contract and shorten, all right? So when I move my hand, what's happening? I'm shortening that muscle, okay? I'm contracting it. Now remember, there's a prime mover and an antagonist that will provide direction in both ways. So I shorten one way and I shorten the other way. All right, same thing with your cardiac muscle. It shortens and it relaxes. It shortens and it relaxes. And it's not just opening, the heart isn't just opening with that relaxation. Remember that term preload, okay? So that is a stretch almost because of the fluid coming back into your heart. And that muscle fiber is elongating again, okay? All right, we're going to talk about some terminology here. Specifically a myofibril within your skeletal muscle. There's these long fibers found in striated muscle, and that striated muscle, as a reminder, is found in skeletal and cardiac muscle. Your skeletal and cardiac muscle is controlled by both the somatic and autonomic nervous system. Remember, the somatic nervous system is going to be your voluntary control, and if you ever get confused on which one's which, remember automatic, autonomic. Your autonomic is your automatic or your involuntary nervous system. All right, we're going to talk about a sarcomere as well, which is a smaller unit within your myofibril, and it contains two things here that we're concerned about, your actin and your myosin. All right, that'll make sense here. I'm going to show you this representation on how this all gets broken down. So if we start over here, let me get my laser pointer. If we start over here, basically, and we follow these pictures, what's happening is we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, okay? So within the skeletal muscle, you get to a muscle bundle, then a fascicle, then a fiber, and then within this fiber, there's a whole bunch of other little tubes called a myofibril, all right? And that's where we're really going to talk about the contraction and the shortening of these muscles, all right? Now within the myofibril, there's these little sections called sarcomeres, all right? And they contain two things called actin and myosin. And what actually happens is this myosin grabs this actin and pulls it along, and it's described as a sliding past each other. The video that I'm going to show you shows a very good representation of this. Now, how does this happen? Well, as we know, ATP from previous lecture, previous video, is kind of your energy currency, right? That's your potential energy within your body. So when the muscle cell receives a signal to shorten and to contract, ATP binds to that myosin, okay? And what happens, remember from your ATP video, when we talk, or actually your sodium-potassium pump, we talk about a phosphorus kind of being like a loaded spring. It's potential energy. So ATP is broken down to ADP, and that loaded spring in the form of phosphorus releases its energy, and that's what gives the myosin to pull against that actin and shorten the muscle. Once again, just remember, I'm going to show you this video. It's got a great representation of it. And that happens over and over and over, and lots of ATP is used for muscle movement. You know that just because you may have exercised at some point, or I hope you have. But what happens after a while? You get tired, you lose energy, your body goes through lots of the ATP. It's always producing more ATP as long as the stores are there as well. And after a while, your muscles could become fatigued, or you just generally start to lose energy towards the end of your workout. All right. Now, important concept here. We're going to talk about this again in cardiac action potential. I know that there's several things that I said I need to talk about in class, and we are going to talk about this in lecture as well. But calcium, all right? This is a really, really important electrolyte in that it causes this whole process to start when it shifts intracellular, okay? And what that means, it moves from outside the cell through a calcium channel. Remember, a channel is kind of like a doorway, right? So the doorway gets opened, calcium moves from the outside to the inside of the cell and causes the muscle movement and this whole process to take place, all right? I'm going to bring you to a video now that shows like I said, a great representation of this, and I'm going to take your advice, and before I go to a full screen, I'm going to turn down my volume. Just give me a minute, please.
You use muscles every day to do activities. This woman is using muscles to breathe, circulate blood, and move her hand to take notes. Your cardiac and smooth muscle tissues are involuntary. You do not consciously control their actions. Skeletal muscle works under voluntary control. Skeletal muscles are composed of bundles of muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are long cylindrical cells containing several nuclei. Muscles will contract or relax when they receive signals from the nervous system. A neuromuscular junction is the site of the signal exchange. This is where the synaptic bulb of an axon terminal and muscle fiber connect. Muscle fibers are composed of many myofibrils. A myofibril contains contractile units called sarcomeres. Sarcomeres run adjacent to one another down the length of the myofibril. Each sarcomere consists of alternating thick and thin protein filaments, giving skeletal muscle its striated appearance. The muscle contracts when these filaments slide past each other. The thick filaments are myosin, which are anchored at the center of the sarcomere, called the M line. The thin filaments are composed of the protein actin, which are anchored to the Z lines on the outer edges of the sarcomere. Because the actin filaments are anchored to the Z lines, the sarcomere shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide.
I'm just going to interrupt the video. You don't need to know M line. You don't need to know Z line. This is a general overview on how skeletal and cardiac muscle contracts.
Along the myosin filaments. Although the action between the filaments is described as sliding, the myosin filament actually pulls the actin along its length. The cross bridges of the myosin filaments attach to the actin filaments and exert force on them to move. This action is known as the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. In this model, the sarcomeres shorten without the thick or thin filaments changing in length. A contraction begins when a bound ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate.
I just want to, you'll hear the term hydrolyzed quite a bit. I just wanted to define that for you. When you talk about ATP, when it's hydrolyzed, that means it's broken down in water, okay?
This causes the myosin head to extend and can attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. An action called the power stroke is triggered, allowing myosin to pull the actin filament toward the M line, thereby shortening the sarcomere. ADP and inorganic phosphate are released during the power stroke. the myosin remains attached to actin until a new molecule of ATP binds, freeing the myosin to either go through another cycle of binding and more contraction or remain unattached to allow the muscle to relax. Muscle contractions are controlled by the actions of calcium. The thin actin filaments are associated with regulatory proteins called troponin and tropomyosin. When a muscle is relaxed, tropomyosin blocks the cross-bridge binding sites on actin. When calcium ion levels are high enough and ATP is present, calcium ions bind to the troponin, which displaces tropomyosin, exposing the myosin binding sites on actin. This allows myosin to attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. Calcium ions are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and are released in response to signals from the nervous system to contract.
You don't need to know that. I'm just allowing this video to play so you get the entire message, but you don't need to know that. Just know that the muscle contraction is enabled because of calcium. All right?
Neurotransmitter molecules are released from a neuron and bind to receptors, which depolarizes the membrane of the muscle fiber. The electrical impulse travels down the T-tubules and opens calcium stores. Calcium ions flow to the myofibrils, where they trigger a muscle contraction. As the actin and myosin slide along each other, the entire sarcomere shortens as the Z lines draw closer to the M line. As the sarcomeres in myofibrils contract, the entire muscle fiber will shorten. When muscle fibers contract in unison, a muscle can produce enough force to move the body, allowing you to take notes.
Okay. So, let's go back here. As always, what I'd like you to do is think of any questions that you may have and bring those to class. You will need to submit those through the assignment link within Blackboard as well.